For as long as you live, you are eternally confronted with this truly philosophical question. How do you respond when things are going to shit? Broadly speaking, we can either accept or reject our fate. However, we cannot simply assume acceptance to be good and rejection to be bad. There are times when acceptance is an act of submission. Likewise, there are times when we reject the circumstances to affirm ourselves. A more thorough analysis is needed to answer this question. Fortunately, Nietzsche's philosophy can help us create an answer for ourselves. One of the core themes in Nietzsche's works is the affirmation of life. Nietzsche often expressed this idea with the Latin phrase Amor Fati. While the literal translation means love of fate, further elaboration is needed to avoid conflating Nietzsche's conception of Amor Fati with the attitude of fatalism. In his book Ecce Homo, Nietzsche states, "My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendaciousness in the face of what is necessary, but love it." This embrace of eternity is linked to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence, but that warrants its own essay, which will come later in the series. Nietzsche's Amor Fati means the affirmation of the totality of life, including even its tragedy. Nietzsche embraced the advantages of his own suffering. In the epilogue of his essay titled Nietzsche contra Wagner, he wrote, "I have often asked myself whether I am not more heavily obligated to the hardest years of my life than to any others. As my inmost nature teaches me, whatever is necessary, as seen from the heights and in the sense of a great economy, is also the useful par excellence. One should not only bear it, one should love it. Amor Fati, that is my inmost nature." Instead of resentment, he responded to life suffering with gratitude. His Amor Fati is not a passive acceptance, it is a joyous reverence for existence. These passages offer an adequate explanation of Nietzsche's conception of Amor Fati, but to understand how this inmost nature manifests itself throughout his philosophy will require further examination. This is necessary if one aspires to embody such an attitude towards life. In Nietzsche's The Gay Science, the fourth book is titled Sanctus Januarius. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation. This distinguishes it from the preceding nameless books of The Gay Science. What makes this particular book so special? It indicates a sense of renewal felt by Nietzsche at the time he was writing it. He even includes a celebratory poem in the beginning of Book 4. He writes, "With a flaming spear you crushed all its ice until my soul, roaring towards the ocean rushed, of its highest hope and goal. Ever healthier it swells, lovingly compelled but free. Thus it lauds your miracles, fairest month of January." Sanctus Januarius references the Christian martyr and saint whose dried blood is believed to be turned liquid on special occasions. It is with the spirit of vitality that Nietzsche writes Book 4 of The Gay Science. After the poem, Nietzsche devotes his initial passage to a joyous affirmation of the new year. He reflects on how he still needs to live because he still needs to think. He notes that people express what is in their hearts and minds on the new year. In this spirit, Nietzsche takes the opportunity to proclaim his own wishes and even makes his own New Year's resolution. He expresses his desire to learn, appreciate the beauty of reality, and make it even more beautiful. He states, "Amor Fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I wish to only be a yes-sayer." He declares his love of fate and wishes to be one who only affirms. His ideal of yes-saying and affirmation of life reoccurs throughout his works. But how do we reconcile this attitude with his relentless criticism of Christianity, philosophers, women, Englishmen, proto-Nazis, and others? The targets of his criticism are primarily those who he thinks embody decadence and negation of life. Therefore, when Nietzsche criticizes ideas that are life-negating, it is a means to affirm life. He only says no as a means to a greater yes. Regardless of this rationalization of Nietzsche's habit of negation, he did not live up to the ideal presented here where he writes, "Looking away shall be my only negation." And perhaps this was out of necessity. His main project in his later productive years was the revaluation of all values, which includes the Antichrist as its first book. To bring about this revaluation, he needed to offer his criticism of the negative aspects of conventional values. Nonetheless, he asserted Amor Fati as his inmost nature. Nietzsche only had contempt for the particular, and affirmed life as a whole, knowing full well the suffering that it entails. Nietzsche felt a melancholic happiness because he was aware that behind all the festivity and noise of life lurks the specter of death. He thought that most people go about their day without much concern for death despite it being an inevitable reality for us all. There is so much commotion and haste to reach the future, but most people become quiet when death is brought up despite it being our shared fate. Should we be worried about this widespread disregard for death? Unlike the existentialists or modern-day Stoics with their incessant morbidity and memento mori, Nietzsche was pleased that most people prefer not to think of death. He writes, "It makes me happy that men do not want to think at all the thought of death. I should like very much to do something that would make the thought of life even 100 times more appealing to them." Nietzsche had a distaste for the gloominess that is characteristic of those who are overly fixated upon death. He shares this attitude with the 17th century philosopher Spinoza, whom he admired and saw as his precursor. In Spinoza's Ethics, he wrote that a free man thinks nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation on life, not on death. Contrary to Nietzsche's observation of people's disregard for death, I've seen the popularization of ideas from Stoic and existential philosophy lead to an increased fixation upon death, and I question whether that's for the best. That's why I find it refreshing to hear Nietzsche and Spinoza's emphasis on life and rejection of this cult of death. There is no need for us to treat this as an either-or between focusing on life versus death. It is perfectly sensible and even necessary to acknowledge the reality of death, since it is a fundamental aspect of our existence. The contemplation of death becomes detrimental when it drains a person of their vitality. On the other hand, there are people who need recurring reminders of death as a means to set themselves straight. If that works for them, great, but I can't help but feel there must be less somber methods of self-discipline. I find a meditation on life to be much more liberating. For those of us who maintain an attitude that affirms life, when our time comes, we can face death without worry, knowing full well that we had a life well lived. In an aphorism titled Faith in Oneself, Nietzsche observed that few people have faith in themselves. He continued by explaining that for the small number of people that do, this is a result of their lack of self-awareness. They would be in for a surprise if they could look within themselves. In our own time, such self-confidence born of ignorance has become ubiquitous. It is a shallow faith that can be only maintained by willful blindness. As for the others who are less self-inclined to self-certainty, their faith in themselves must be earned. All their efforts are performed to refute their inner critic and convince themselves of their own worth. Nietzsche concludes the aphorism by calling them the great self-dissatisfied people. Both characterizations are unappealing, but I believe it is better to be self-critical than self-deceived. One can only live in delusion for so long until crisis shatters it. In times of chaos, those who are self-aware are the most prepared. However, such awareness may come at the cost of doubt and excessive self-criticism. It is far from ideal to be dissatisfied with oneself. The self-torturing attitude characterized in this passage resembles the bad conscience described in Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. In that book, he explains that the bad conscience is an internalized feeling of guilt that arises from punishment. Our aggressive instincts, when unable to be outwardly expressed, are turned inward and become bad conscience. Later in the book, he clarifies that bad conscience is an illness. There is no doubt about that, but an illness as pregnancy is an illness. A similar attitude can be applied to our sense of self-doubt. If we can overcome our self-doubt, we can give birth to a new way of being. We need not fear our inner skeptic. If we learn to master this voice from within, we will have exchanged our worst tyrant for our greatest teacher. We will still be severe with ourselves, but instead with a good conscience. We will strive, not out of desperation to convince ourselves, but rather because we have full confidence in our own potential. We will have faith in ourselves, just as any good teacher would have for their student. In an aphorism titled New Caution, Nietzsche states, "Let us stop thinking so much about punishing, reproaching, and improving others." He observed that it is hard enough to change a person. Furthermore, our impact may result in unintended consequences. Nonetheless, such efforts at condemning and preaching to others have continued to be prevalent. In our own time, this has likely become worse. The advent of social media and other disruptive technologies have amplified extremism, divisiveness, and hostility. I agree with Nietzsche that it is rare for most people to significantly change after punishing, reproaching, or demanding them to improve. Too often, such enforcement leads to a radicalization of the opposition, and this phenomenon is all too apparent in the dismal state of contemporary politics. Unless a person has a strong will to change for the better, there is little chance of them being improved by the influence of others. So if there are such abysmal chances at meaningfully impacting society, what else can we do? Nietzsche suggests that instead, we should strive to have greater influence on the future compared to our adversaries. Whether or not you agree with Nietzsche's recommendation, his approach proved to be extremely fruitful considering his extraordinary influence on future generations. Nietzsche knew better than to waste his efforts on petty squabbles. To this day, it is evident that complaining and misguided efforts at improvement just evolve into needless quarreling. We ought to raise ourselves above such small-minded and fruitless behavior. It would be a mistake to join these miserable so-called improvers in their vain attempts to change the world. There is no need to drag ourselves in the mud in order to wrestle with swine. When faced with such unsightliness, Nietzsche advised it is best to look away instead. However, looking away doesn't mean closing our eyes to reality. Rather, we should set our sights higher while focusing on what's within our power. There is no way to eliminate all the suffering and malevolence in the world. Instead, we must strive towards excellence and exemplify our brilliance. We can overcome the terrible aspects of existence by bringing forth the best within ourselves and sharing it with the world. In doing so, we can light the way for others to flourish and bring forth their own gifts. If we continue this process, even life at its worst can be redeemed because the dreadful will be outshined by all that is beautiful. Nietzsche observed that the people of his time had a historical sense, in other words, a self-perception that encompasses the vast span of human history. He saw this as an unprecedented and remarkable development that had the potential to grow into something great. Instead of fixating on the mundane and trivial aspects of today, the historical sense enriches us with a broader perspective across time. In a poem from the West Eastern Divan, Goethe writes, "Let him who fails to learn and mark 3,000 years still stay, void of experience in the dark, and live from day to day." To put it less poetically, anyone who fails to draw upon the vast span of human culture across the ages is blind and impoverished. This perspective is not just limited to the past. Nietzsche notes that modern man has unknowingly begun to establish a powerful link to a future feeling. Nietzsche himself exemplifies this link to the future through his writings, where he often addresses future generations. Many of his most famous ideas, such as the Übermensch or the death of God, were expressed with the future in mind. Nietzsche drew upon the best of the past to pave the way for a philosophy of the future. There is always a risk when looking back in time. The sentiment prompted by the historical sense may appear to us as a decline from the splendors of the past. If a person were able to experience history as his own, he would be struck with the most overwhelming grief over the loss of what man used to be. To wallow in such feelings would be a counterproductive attitude towards history. In one of the essays from Nietzsche's book, Untimely Meditations, he begins by quoting Goethe, who wrote, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without augmenting or directly invigorating my activity." Nietzsche applied this attitude towards history and stated, "We need history, that is to say, for the sake of life and action, not so as to turn comfortably away from life and action." Following both their examples, we should learn history to empower ourselves, not to escape reality or become disillusioned by it. While it can be depressing to acknowledge our decline when compared to the great heights of the past, there is a way to go beyond this outlook. Like the Roman god Janus, depicted with two faces, you must face both past and future. Just as Janus was associated with transitions and beginnings, you can become a gateway in which the best of the past is carried forward into the future. Your acts of self-overcoming can help bring forth the dawn of a new age for humanity. Nietzsche concludes, "If one could burden one's soul with all this, the oldest, the newest, losses, hopes, conquests, and the victories of humanity, if one could finally contain all this in one soul and crowd it into a single feeling, this would surely have to result in a happiness that humanity has not known so far. The happiness of a God full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness that, like the sun in the evening, continually bestows its inexhaustible riches, pouring them into the sea, feeling richest, as the sun does, only when even the poorest fisherman is still rowing with golden oars. This godlike feeling would then be called humaneness. To embrace the totality of human experience across past, present, and future would be the ultimate triumph. Only by experiencing the depths of the abyss can one fully appreciate the joyous heights of life. Through the ecstasy of this radical conception of humaneness, man transcends the seeming bareness of existence and uses his creative powers to revitalize the world. Back to my original question. How do you respond when things are going to shit? While there are plenty of valid ways to respond, the first step is to embrace reality. The only way to move forward is to affirm life in its totality. This is not a call to pacifism or submission. It includes accepting life's challenges and being willing to fight back when necessary. The power to affirm life means taking everything that life throws at you and turning it to your advantage. How do you find the strength to love your fate? By becoming the master of your fate. Even though you don't have complete control over your circumstances, you have the power of choosing your response, and this is the most decisive factor in determining your destiny. If everything is falling apart, the most reliable strategy is to bet on yourself. That does not mean that you have to fight this battle alone. Your greatest weapon is your ability to empower and inspire others. You must lead them by example, face what you most fear, and keep moving forward. Muster the courage to set foot into the fire, for it is out of those flames that you will be reborn.